The Year of the Black Pony by Walt Morey, Chapter 4. I'll bet ours was the oddest-looking wedding party the Valley's ever seen. We drove into Sunrise in the buggy, Ma, Mr. Chase, and Ellie in the seat. I sat in the box behind and let my legs dangle. Mr. Chase drove. His long length was hunched over, elbows on knees. He held the reins lightly and looked straight ahead. He had shaved, put on the wrinkled blue suit that he'd worn at the hearing, and he wore a tie. Ma sat on the far side of the seat, very erect, head high, looking straight ahead. Ellie sat between them. Ma and Mr. Chase didn't exchange 2 words all the way to town. Ellie chattered for a little while, but no one paid any attention, and she finally stopped. I don't think she understood what was going on. I did. And I didn't like having this big, grim-looking man taking Pa's place. The thought of being with him every day kept a small fear alive. Mr. Chase let Nellie poke along at a slow walk, as if he was postponing the inevitable to the last possible moment. We stopped at the courthouse, and Ma and Mr. Chase went in and got the license. Then we drove on through town to Reverend Jackson's. The church was at the far end of town on a slight rise of ground. The Reverend and his wife lived in a small parsonage behind the church. Reverend Jackson answered Ma's knock. He smiled and said, "Why, Mrs. Fellows and Mr. Chase, come in, come in. Georgia," he called to the kitchen, "we have company." Mrs. Jackson was as thin as her husband. She had big, solemn gray eyes and brown hair piled high on her head. It made her look taller than the Reverend. They sat down in straight-back chairs facing each other, all except Ellie and me. We stood on either side of Ma. The Reverend and his wife looked at us, and we looked back at them. They seemed at a loss for words, probably because they were so startled to see Ma and Mr. Chase together. Mr. Chase was as uncomfortable as a grasshopper in a hot skillet. He didn't seem to know what to do with his big hands. He pulled at the fingers on his right hand until I expected to hear the knuckles crack. Realizing what he was doing, he folded his arms across his chest. Then he held his hands, fingers laced tightly together between his knees. Finally, he put a hand on each knee, straightened his arms, and sort of braced himself, as if he expected to get hit an awful wallop. Ma seemed the only calm, comfortable person there. She sat straight and tall and smiled at Reverend Jackson and his wife. Reverend Jackson finally spoke to Mr. Chase like he was trying to put him at ease. "I haven't seen you at services the past few weeks." Mr. Chase shook his head. "There's an awful lot of work on a ranch with spring and all." "I can imagine, but a man should labor 6 days and rest on the 7th. "Kind of hard to explain that to the cattle and a growing crop," Mr. Chase said. "I know," Reverend Jackson said. "And how do the cattle and the crops seem?" "Little early to tell about the alfalfa, but it looks like a good first cutting, if we don't get the rain to spoil it. Cattle came through the winter fine." Reverend Jackson then turned to Ma. "And how are things out your way, Mrs. Fellows?" "With the cattle, chickens, and alfalfa, they're fine," Ma said. "With us, they aren't good." "When I was out there not long ago, you said everything was going well." "That was my hope, Reverend, but we're licked. The children and I simply can't go on living there. That's why we've come to you." "What can I do to help?" "Mr. Chase and I have talked it over, and we've arrived at a decision that the best interests of all can be served only by us getting married." "Married? You too?" Reverend Jackson adjusted his glasses. His big blue eyes turned from Ma to Mr. Chase. "That's why you've come here? You want me to perform a marriage?" "That's correct," Ma said. Mr. Chase nodded. I see, Reverend Jackson rubbed his thin hands together. I guess he'd never bargained on meeting this kind of problem. He was suddenly nervous. I almost might say embarrassed. "Don't you think that under the circumstances you're, rushing things a bit? It would appear much better if you waited, say, 6 months or even a year." "It probably would look better," Ma agreed. She explained about the shortage of money and that there were things needing doing on a ranch that only a man could do. Reverend Jackson frowned thoughtfully. "I understand. But in view of the unfortunate tragedy and the fact that you will be married a long time, I still think it wise to make every effort to wait." "If we do," Ma pointed out, "the children and I must have help to live at our place. That means that Mr. Chase will be coming over quite often for one reason or another. He hasn't got time to take care of two places, and the very fact that he would come would start tongues wagging. Believe me, Reverend, I know how gossip can run wild in a small town. This is the only practical way, and facing up to it openly will stop talk." "That's possible," Jackson agreed. "I wasn't thinking of gossip altogether. There's another consideration that should be more important to both of you. Gossip would eventually die out. What could that be? Neither of you has said one word about love and affection." "Reverend," Ma said, "I've read the Bible from cover to cover many times, and it's full of things about widows remarrying and wives who are good to their husbands and families. But I have found little about love and affection between husband and wife. It often refers to respect and goodness, and it does state that the price of a good wife is far above rubies. I intend to be a good wife." Reverend Jackson looked at Mr. Chase. "Do you agree with Mrs. Fellowes' sentiments?" Mr. Chase nodded. "I sure do. Yes, sir, I do." "Of course, you understand I can't perform the ceremony without a license." Mr. Chase took the license from his pocket and extended it without a word. Reverend Jackson looked at it. "Everything seems to be in order." "Reverend," Ma asked, "is there any legal reason we shouldn't marry?" "No legal reason. We came to you because this is the only church in town and you are our pastor. But if you'd rather not perform this ceremony, we'll go back to Judge Beam." "That won't be necessary. I was only trying to point out what I consider valid reasons for waiting. But since you're both determined, I'll perform the ceremony." There was only one small hitch. When the Reverend asked for the ring, Mr. Chase looked blank. But Ma calmly slipped her wedding band off and handed it to him. After the short ceremony, Reverend Jackson and his wife shook hands with Ma and Mr. Chase and wished them well. Reverend Jackson said, "I hope what we've done is the right thing and that everything works out the way you want it to. If there is ever something I can do to help, please let me know." Ma said, "It was the only practical solution, Reverend. Now we'll simply have to work at it." "Yes," he agreed, "you will." I sat in back again as we drove through town and out the road leading to Frank Chase's cabin. Again, Mr. Chase was hunched over, elbows on knees, holding the reins loosely in his hands, letting Nellie take her own sweet time. Something of the seriousness of the occasion had got through to Ellie, and for once she was quiet. Ma sat as she had before, very erect, her head high, looking straight ahead. The only sounds I remember were the soft plop of Nellie's feet in the dust and the wheels running over an occasional rock. Mr. Chase spoke only once all the way back. "Lucky you had a ring. I never even thought about that. Only thing I could have given you would have been a bent horseshoe nail." "It doesn't matter," Ma said. At the cabin, Ma got dinner from the lean stores of food on Mr. Chase's shelves. But Mr. Chase said afterwards it was the best meal he'd eaten in a long time. "It will be better," Ma said, "when we get our food over here." There was still a good part of the afternoon left. Ma and Mr. Chase decided that he and I should take the wagon and go over to our old place and bring back our food, bedclothes, and the chickens. While he went to hitch up, Ma talked to Ellie and me. She set us both down at the table and said, "Now, I want you to both remember that my new name is Mrs. Mabel Chase, not Fellowes anymore," she said for Ellie's benefit. "We changed that at the minister's this morning." "Is our name Chase now, too?" I asked. "No, you are still Christopher Fellowes and Eddie Fellowes." Ellie puckered up, ready to cry. "You're not our mother anymore?" "Of course I am, honey. But now that we're going to live with Mr. Chase in his house, I have his name, that's all. Mr. Chase is known as your stepfather. He'll take care of us just as Daddy used to. Now do you understand?" "I guess so," Ellie sniffed. Ma put an arm around her and said, "It's going to be all right. Mother says so. Now," she looked straight at me, "you're both to obey Mr. Chase, just as if he was your real father. I don't want to hear of you arguing or sassing him. If he tells you to do something, do it. Christopher, is that clear?" I nodded, but she kept talking straight at me. I'm sure you'll find Mr. Chase a fair and just man. If things do go wrong and it seems like there may be trouble, you're to come to me. If you're right, I'll stand up for you just as I did with your father. If you aren't, I won't. Do you understand?" I said yes. "Another thing, you may have to give a little," Ma warned. "Always remember we're intruding on his way of living. This isn't easy for him, taking on a family. Being a bachelor, he may not have been around children much. He's got to get used to us as we've got to get used to him. We're all strangers. It's going to take a little time to get to know each other." "All right," I said. And I thought of something and asked, "Ma, what do we call him?" "Mr. Chase, of course," Ma said promptly. A minute later, the wagon rattled around to the front of the house. Mr. Chase had a good wagon and a fast-stepping team named Jess and Jip. We got to our place in less than half an hour. By the time we loaded all our food and stripped the beds of blankets, sheets, and pillows, the sun was dropping and night was seeping into the sky. We waited about half an hour. Then the chickens went to roost. It was no problem catching them and stuffing them into gunny sacks. Ma and Ellie had supper ready when we got back. By the time we'd eaten, unloaded the wagon, turned the chickens loose in the barn, and I'd milked Fawn, it was getting late. The hay in the barn made mighty soft sleeping. We each had 2 blankets. I spread one on the hay, the other I rolled up in. Mr. Chase spread his blanket a few feet away. We didn't talk. In fact, all the time we'd worked together at our place, we'd hardly said a word. I was a little bit afraid of him. He sat up a long time and stared out the open barn door at the night, like a big, lean, black shadow. He might have been stone, except I heard him sigh and mutter under his breath, "What a day! Lord, what a day!" It was very still. The chickens complained sleepily. Nellie wandered past the door. Beyond Mr. Chase, I could see a square of night sky and the stars. I kept thinking, that man over there is my stepfather. Ma's name is Mrs. Mabel Chase. It didn't sound right. That man had taken Pa's place. His home was now our home. I had to work with him every day. He had the right to wail the daylights out of me just like Pa used to. I wondered what kind of temper he had. Pretty bad, I decided. The thought of him laying a hand on me turned me cold. I thought of Reverend Jackson's last words as we left his house. "I hope what we've done is the right thing and that everything works out just like you want it to." I just didn't see how it could.